Chapter 7. Get up. What you 'bout? I opened my eyes and looked around, trying to make out where I was. It was after sunup and I had been sound asleep. Pap was standing over me looking sour and sick too. He says, "What you doing with this gun?" I judged he didn't know nothing about what he had been doing, so I says, "Somebody tried to get in, so I was laying for him." "Why didn't you rouse me out?" "Well, I tried to, but I couldn't. I couldn't budge you." "Well, all right. Don't stand there palavering all day, but out with you and see if there's a fish on the lines for breakfast. I'll be along in a minute." He unlocked the door and I cleared out up the riverbank. I noticed some pieces of limbs and such things floating down and a sprinkling of bark, so I knowed the river had begun to rise. I reckoned I would have great times now if I was over at the town. The June rise used to be always luck for me, because as soon as that rise begins here comes cordwood floating down and pieces of log rafts, sometimes a dozen logs together, so all you have to do is to catch them and sell them to the wood yards and the sawmill. I went along up the bank with one eye out for Pap and t'other one out for what the rise might fetch along. Well, all at once here comes a canoe, just a beauty too, about 13 or 14 foot long, riding high like a duck. I shot head first off of the bank like a frog, clothes and all on, and struck out for the canoe. I just expected there'd be somebody laying down in it, because people often done that to fool folks, and when a chap had pulled a skiff out most to it, they'd raise up and laugh at him. But it weren't so this time. It was a drift canoe sure enough, and I clumb in and paddled her ashore. Thinks I, the old man will be glad when he sees this. She's worth $10. But when I got to shore, Pap wasn't in sight yet, and as I was running her into a little creek like a gully, all hung over with vines and willows, I struck another idea. I judged I'd hide her good, and then, instead of taking to the woods when I run off, I'd go down the river about 50 mile and camp in one place for good and not have such a rough time tramping on foot. It was pretty close to the shanty, and I thought I heard the old man coming all the time, but I got her hid, and then I out and looked around a bunch of willows, and there was the old man down the path a piece just drawing a bead on a bird with his gun. So he hadn't seen anything. When he got along, I was hard at it taking up a trot line. He abused me a little for being so slow, but I told him I fell in the river, and that was what made me so long. I knowed he would see I was wet, and then he would be asking questions. We got 5 catfish off the lines and went home. While we laid off after breakfast to sleep up, both of us being about wore out, I got to thinking that if I could fix up some way to keep Pap and the widow from trying to follow me, it would be a certainer thing than trusting to luck to get far enough off before they missed me. You see, all kinds of things might happen. Well, I didn't see no way for a while, but by and by Pap raised up a minute to drink another barrel of water, and he says, "Another time a man comes a-prowling round here, you rouse me out, you hear? That man weren't here for no good. I'd 'a shot him. Next time you rouse me out, you hear?" Then he dropped down and went to sleep again. But what he had been saying give me the very idea I wanted. I says to myself, I can fix it now so nobody won't think of following me. About 12 o'clock we turned out and went along up the bank. The river was coming up pretty fast, and lots of driftwood going by on the rise. By and by along comes part of a log raft, 9 logs fast together. We went out with the skiff and towed it ashore. Then we had dinner. Anybody but Pap would have waited and seen the day through so as to catch more stuff, but that weren't Pap's style. 9 logs was enough for one time. He must shove right over to town and sell. So he locked me in and took the skiff and started off towing the raft about 3:30. I judged he wouldn't come back that night. I waited till I reckoned he had got a good start. Then I out with my saw and went to work on that log again. Before he was t'other side of the river, I was out of the hole. Him and his raft was just a speck on the water away off yonder. I took the sack of cornmeal and took it to where the canoe was hid, and shoved the vines and branches apart and put it in. Then I done the same with the side of bacon, then the whiskey jug. I took all the coffee and sugar there was and all the ammunition. I took the wadding. I took the bucket and gourd. I took a dipper and a tin cup and my old saw and 2 blankets and the skillet and the coffee pot. I took fish lines and matches and other things, everything that was worth a cent. I cleaned out the place. I wanted an axe, but there wasn't any, only the one out at the woodpile, and I knowed why I was going to leave that. I fetched out the gun, and now I was done. I had wore the ground a good deal crawling out of the hole and dragging out so many things. So I fixed that as good as I could from the outside by scattering dust on the place, which covered up the smoothness and the sawdust. Then I fixed the piece of log back into its place and put 2 rocks under it and one against it to hold it there, for it was bent up at that place and didn't quite touch ground. If you stood 4 or 5 foot away and didn't know it was sawed, you wouldn't never notice it. And besides, this was the back of the cabin, and it weren't likely anybody would go fooling around there. It was all grass clear to the canoe, so I hadn't left a track. I followed around to see. I stood on the bank and looked out over the river, all safe. So I took the gun and went up a piece into the woods and was hunting around for some birds when I see a wild pig. Hogs soon went wild in them bottoms after they had got away from the prairie farms. I shot this fellow and took him into camp. I took the axe and smashed in the door. I beat it and hacked it considerable a doing it. I fetched the pig in and took him back nearly to the table and hacked into his throat with the axe and laid him down on the ground to bleed. I say ground because it was ground hard packed and no boards. Well, next I took an old sack and put a lot of big rocks in it, all I could drag, and I started it from the pig and dragged it to the door and through the woods down to the river and dumped it in, and down it sunk, out of sight. You could easy see that something had been dragged over the ground. I did wish Tom Sawyer was there. I knowed he would take an interest in this kind of business and throw in the fancy touches. Nobody could spread himself like Tom Sawyer in such a thing as that. Well, last I pulled out some of my hair and blooded the axe good and stuck it on the back side and slung the axe in the corner. Then I took up the pig and held him to my breast with my jacket so he couldn't drip, till I got a good piece below the house and then dumped him into the river. Now I thought of something else. So I went and got the bag of meal and my old saw out of the canoe and fetched them to the house. I took the bag to where it used to stand and ripped a hole in the bottom of it with the saw, for there weren't no knives and forks on the place. Pap done everything with his clasp knife about the cooking. Then I carried the sack about 100 yards across the grass and through the willows east of the house to a shallow lake that was 5 miles wide and full of rushes, and ducks too, you might say, in the season. There was a slough or a creek leading out of it on the other side that went miles away, I don't know where, but it didn't go to the river. The meal sifted out and made a little track all the way to the lake. I dropped Pap's whetstone there too so as to look like it had been done by accident. Then I tied up the rip in the meal sack with a string so it wouldn't leak no more, and took it and my saw to the canoe again. It was about dark now, so I dropped the canoe down the river under some willows that hung over the bank and waited for the moon to rise. I made fast to a willow. Then I took a bite to eat, and by laid down in the canoe to smoke a pipe and lay out a plan. I says to myself, they'll follow the track of that sackful of rocks to the shore and then drag the river for me, and they'll follow that meal track to the lake and go browsing down the creek that leads out of it to find the robbers that killed me and took the things. They won't ever hunt the river for anything but my dead carcass. They'll soon get tired of that and won't bother no more about me. All right, I can stop anywhere I want to. Jackson's Island is good enough for me. I know that island pretty well and nobody ever comes there. And then I can paddle over to town nights and slink around and pick up things I want. Jackson's Island's the place. I was pretty tired and the first thing I knowed I was asleep. When I woke up I didn't know where I was for a minute. I sat up and looked around, a little scared. Then I remembered. The river looked miles and miles across. The moon was so bright I could have counted the drift logs that went a-slipping along, black and still, hundreds of yards out from shore. Everything was dead quiet, and it looked late and smelt late. You know what I mean? I don't know the words to put it in. I took a good gap and a stretch and was just going to unhitch and start when I heard a sound away over the water. I listened. Pretty soon I made it out. It was that dull kind of irregular sound that comes from oars working in rowlocks when it's a still night. I peeped out through the willow branches, and there it was, a skiff, away across the water. I couldn't tell how many was in it. It kept a-coming, and when it was abreast of me, I see there weren't but one man in it. Thinks I, maybe it's Pap, though I weren't expecting him. He dropped below me with the current, and by he came a-swinging up shore in the easy water, and he went by so close I could reached out the gun and touched him. Well, it was Pap, sure enough, and sober too, by the way he laid his oars. I didn't lose no time. The next minute I was ass-spinning downstream, soft but quick in the shade of the bank. I made 2.5 miles and then struck out 1/4 mile or more towards the middle of the river, because pretty soon I would be passing the ferry landing, and people might see me and hail me. I got out amongst the driftwood, and then laid down in the bottom of the canoe and let her float. I laid there and had a good rest and a smoke out of my pipe, looking away into the sky. Not a cloud in it. The sky looks ever so deep when you lay down on your back in the moonshine. I never knowed it before. And how far a body can hear on the water such nights. I heard people talking at the ferry landing. I heard what they said too, every word of it. One man said it was getting towards the long days and the short nights now. T'other one said, this weren't one of the short ones, he reckoned. And then they laughed, and he said it over again, and they laughed again. Then they waked up another fellow and told him and laughed. But he didn't laugh. He ripped out something brisk and said let him alone. The first fellow said he loathed to tell it to his old woman. She would think it was pretty good. But he said that weren't nothing to some things he had said in his time. I heard one man say it was nearly 3 o'clock, and he hoped daylight wouldn't wait more than about a week longer. After that, the talk got further and further away, and I couldn't make out the words anymore. But I could hear the mumble, and now and then a laugh too, but it seemed a long ways off. I was away below the ferry now. I rose up, and there was Jackson's Island about 2.5 miles downstream, heavy timbered and standing up out of the middle of the river, big and dark and solid, like a steamboat without any lights. There weren't any signs of the bar at the head. It was all under water now. It didn't take me long to get there. I shot past the head at a ripping rate. The current was so swift, and then I got into the dead water and landed on the side towards the Illinois shore. I run the canoe into a deep dent in the bank that I knowed about. I had to part the willow branches to get in, and when I made fast, nobody could have seen the canoe from the outside. I went up and sat down on a log at the head of the island and looked out on the big river and the black driftwood and away over to the town 3 miles away, where there was 3 or 4 lights twinkling. A monstrous big lumber raft was about 1 mile upstream, coming along down with a lantern in the middle of it. I watched it come creeping down, and when it was most abreast of where I stood, I heard a man say, "Stern oars there! Heave her head to starboard!" I heard that just as plain as if the man was by my side. There was a little gray in the sky now, so I stepped into the woods and laid down for a nap before breakfast. Chapter 8. The sun was up so high when I waked that I judged it was after 8 o'clock. I laid there in the grass in the cool shade thinking about things and feeling rested and rather comfortable and satisfied. I could see the sun out at 1 or 2 holes, but mostly it was big trees all about and gloomy in there amongst them. There was freckled places on the ground where the light sifted down through the leaves, and the freckled places swapped about a little, showing there was a little breeze up there. A couple of squirrels sat on a limb and jabbered at me very friendly. I was powerful lazy and comfortable, didn't want to get up and cook breakfast. Well, I was dozing off again when I thinks I hears a deep sound of boom away up the river. I rouses up and rests on my elbow and listens. Pretty soon I hears it again. I hopped up and went and looked out at a hole in the leaves, and I see a bunch of smoke laying on the water a long ways up, about abreast the ferry. And there was the ferry boat full of people floating along down. I knowed what was the matter now. Boom! I see the white smoke squirt out of the ferry boat's side. You see, they was firing cannon over the water trying to make my carcass come to the top. I was pretty hungry, but it weren't going to do for me to start a fire because they might see the smoke. So I sat there and watched the cannon smoke and listened to the boom. The river was a mile wide there, and it always looks pretty on a summer morning. So I was having a good enough time seeing them hunt for my remainders if I only had a bite to eat. Well, then I happened to think how they always put quicksilver in loaves of bread and float them off, because they always go right to the drowned carcass and stop there. So, says I'll keep a lookout, and if any of them's floating around after me, I'll give them a show. I changed to the Illinois edge of the island to see what luck I could have, and I weren't disappointed. A big double loaf come along, and I most got it with a long stick, but my foot slipped and she floated out further. Of course, I was where the current set in the closest to the shore. I knowed enough for that. But by and by along comes another one, and this time I won. I took out the plug and shook out the little dab of quicksilver and set my teeth in. It was baker's bread. What the quality eat. None of your low-down corn pone. I got a good place amongst the leaves and sat there on a log, munching the bread and watching the ferry boat, and very well satisfied. And then something struck me. I says, now I reckon the widow or the parson or somebody prayed that this bread would find me, and here it has gone and done it. So there ain't no doubt, but there is something in that thing. That is, there's something in it when a body like the widow or the parson prays, but it don't work for me. And I reckon it don't work for only just the right kind. I lit a pipe and had a good long smoke and went on watching. The ferry boat was floating with the current, and I allowed I'd have a chance to see who was aboard when she come along, because she would come in close, where the bread did. When she'd got pretty well along down towards me, I put out my pipe and went to where I fished out the bread and laid down behind a log on the bank in a little open place. Where the log forked I could peep through. By and by she come along, and she drifted in so close that they could have run out a plank and walked ashore. Most everybody was on the boat. Pap and Judge Thatcher and Bessie Thatcher and Joe Harper and Tom Sawyer and his old Aunt Polly and Sid and Mary and plenty more. Everybody was talking about the murder, but the captain broke in and says, "Look sharp now. The current sets in the closest here, and maybe he's washed ashore and got tangled amongst the brush at the water's edge. I hope so, anyway." I didn't hope so. They all crowded up and leaned over the rails nearly in my face and kept still, watching with all their might. I could see them first rate, but they couldn't see me. Then the captain sung out, "Stand away!" And the cannon let off such a blast right before me that it made me deaf with the noise and pretty near blind with the smoke, and I judged I was gone. If they'd had some bullets in, I reckon they'd got the corpse they was after. Well, I see I weren't hurt, thanks to goodness. The boat floated on and went out of sight around the shoulder of the island. I could hear the booming now and then, further and further off, and by, after an hour, I didn't hear it no more. The island was 3 miles long. I judged they had got to the foot and was giving it up. But they didn't yet a while. They turned around the foot of the island and started up the channel on the Missouri side under steam and booming once in a while as they went. I crossed over to that side and watched them. When they got abreast the head of the island, they quit shooting and dropped over to the Missouri shore and went home to the town. I knowed I was all right now. Nobody else would come a-hunting after me. I got my traps out of the canoe and made me a nice camp in the thick woods. I made a kind of a tent out of my blankets to put my things under so the rain couldn't get at them. I catched a catfish and haggled him open with my saw, and towards sundown I started my campfire and had supper. Then I set out a line to catch some fish for breakfast. When it was dark, I sat by my campfire smoking and feeling pretty well satisfied. But by and by it got sort of lonesome, and so I went and sat on the bank and listened to the current swashing along and counted the stars and drift logs and rafts that come down, and then went to bed. There ain't no better way to put in time when you are lonesome. You can't stay so. You soon get over it. And so for 3 days and nights, no difference, just the same thing. But the next day I went exploring around down through the island. I was boss of it. It all belonged to me, so to say, and I wanted to know all about it. But mainly, I wanted to put in the time. I found plenty strawberries, ripe and prime, and green summer grapes, and green raspberries, and the green blackberries was just beginning to show. They would all come handy by and by, I judged. Well, I went fooling along in the deep woods till I judged I weren't far from the foot of the island. I had my gun along, but I hadn't shot nothing. It was for protection. Thought I would kill some game nigh home. About this time I mighty near stepped on a good-sized snake, and it went sliding off through the grass and flowers, and I after it, trying to get a shot at it. I clipped along, and all of a sudden I bounded right onto the ashes of a campfire that was still smoking. My heart jumped up amongst my lungs. I never waited for to look further, but uncocked my gun and went sneaking back on my tiptoes as fast as ever I could. Every now and then I stopped a second amongst the thick leaves and listened, but my breath come so hard I couldn't hear nothing else. I slunk along another piece further, then listened again, and so on, and so on. If I see a stump, I took it for a man. If I trod on a stick and broke it, it made me feel like a person had cut one of my breaths in two, and I only got half, and the short half too. When I got to camp, I weren't feeling very brash. There weren't much sand in my craw, but I says, this ain't no time to be fooling around. So I got all my traps into my canoe again so as to have them out of sight, and I put out the fire and scattered the ashes around to look like an old last year's camp, and then clumb a tree. I reckon I was up in the tree 2 hours, but I didn't see nothing. I didn't hear nothing. I only thought I heard and seen as much as 1,000 things. Well, I couldn't stay up there forever, so at last I got down, but I kept in the thick woods and on the lookout all the time. All I could get to eat was berries and what was left over from breakfast. By the time it was night, I was pretty hungry. So when it was good and dark, I slid out from shore before moonrise and paddled over to the Illinois bank, about 1/4 mile. I went out in the woods and cooked a supper, and I had about made up my mind I would stay there all night when I hear a plunkety-plunk, plunkety-plunk, and says to myself, horses coming. And next I hear people's voices. I got everything into the canoe as quick as I could, and then went creeping through the woods to see what I could find out. I hadn't got far when I hear a man say, "We better camp here if we can find a good place. The horses is about beat out. Let's look around." I didn't wait, but shoved out and paddled away easy. I tied up in the old place and reckoned I would sleep in the canoe. I didn't sleep much. I couldn't somehow for thinking. And every time I waked up I thought somebody had me by the neck. So the sleep didn't do me no good. By and by I says to myself, I can't live this way. I'm going to find out who it is that's here on the island with me. I'll find it out or bust. Well, I felt better right off. So I took my paddle and slid out from shore just a step or two, and then let the canoe drop along down amongst the shadows. The moon was shining, and outside of the shadows it made it most as light as day. I poked along well on to an hour, everything still as rocks and sound asleep. Well, by this time I was most down to the foot of the island. A little ripply, cool breeze begun to blow, and that was as good as saying the night was about done. I give her a turn with the paddle and brung her nose to shore. Then I got my gun and slipped out and into the edge of the woods. I sat down there on a log and looked out through the leaves. I see the moon go off watch and the darkness begin to blanket the river. But in a little while I see a pale streak over the treetops and knowed the day was coming. So I took my gun and slipped off towards where I had run across that campfire, stopping every minute or two to listen. But I hadn't no luck somehow. I couldn't seem to find the place. But by and by, sure enough, I catched a glimpse of fire away through the trees. I went for it, cautious and slow. By and by, I was close enough to have a look, and there laid a man on the ground. It most give me the fantods. He had a blanket around his head, and his head was nearly in the fire. I sat there behind a clump of bushes in about 6 foot of him, and kept my eyes on him steady. It was getting gray daylight now. Pretty soon he gapped and stretched himself and hove off the blanket, and it was Miss Watson's Jim. I bet I was glad to see him. I says, "Hello, Jim," and skipped out. He bounced up and stared at me wild. Then he drops down on his knees and puts his hands together and says, "Don't hurt me, don't. I hain't ever done no harm to a ghost. I always like dead people and done all I could for 'em. You go and get into River Agan while you belongs, and don't do nothing to old Jim, at us I'll lose your friend." Well, I weren't long making him understand I weren't dead. I was ever so glad to see Jim. I weren't lonesome now. I told him I weren't afraid of him telling the people where I was. I talked along, but he only sat there and looked at me, never said nothing. Then I says, "It's good daylight. Lee's get breakfast. Make up your campfire good. What's the use of making up the campfire to cook strawberries and sitch truck? But you got a gun, hain't you? Then we can get something better than strawberries." "Strawberries and such truck," I says. "Is that what you live on?" "I couldn't get nothing else," he says. "Why, how long you been on the island, Jim?" "I come here the night arter you's killed." "What? All that time?" "Yes, indeedy." "And ain't you had nothing but that kind of rubbish to eat?" "No, sah, nothing else." "Well, you must be most starved, ain't you?" "I reckon I could eat a hoss. I think I could. How long you been on the Elon?" "Since the night I got killed." "No, why? What has you lived on? But you got a gun." "Oh yes, you got a gun. That's good. Now you kill something on, I'll make up the fire." So we went over to where the canoe was, and while he built a fire in a grassy, open place amongst the trees, I fetched meal and bacon and coffee pot and frying pan and sugar and tin cups, and the nigger was set back considerable, because he reckoned it was all done with witchcraft. I catched a good big catfish too, and Jim cleaned him with his knife and fried him. When breakfast was ready, we lolled on the grass and eat it smoking hot. Jim laid it in with all his might, for he was most about starved. Then when we had got pretty well stuffed, we laid off and lazied. By and by Jim says, "But looky here, Huck, who was it that ooze killed in dat shanty if it weren't you?" Then I told him the whole thing, and he said it was smart. He said Tom Sawyer couldn't get up no better plan than what I had. Then I says, "How do you come to be here, Jim? And how'd you get here?" He looked pretty uneasy and didn't say nothing for a minute. Then he says, "Maybe I better not tell." "Why, Jim?" "Well, day's reasons, but you wouldn't tell on me if I us to tell you, would you, Huck?" "Blamed if I would, Jim." "Well, I believe you, Huck. I run off." "Jim, but mind, you said you wouldn't tell. You said you wouldn't tell, Huck." "Well, I did. I said I wouldn't, and I'll stick to it. Honest Injun, I will. People would call me a low-down abolitionist and despise me for keeping mum. But that don't make no difference. I ain't a-going to tell, and I ain't a-going back there anyways. So now, lees know all about it." Well, you see, it is this way. Old that's Miss Watson. She pecks on me all the time, untreats me pooty rough, but she allus said she wouldn't sell me down to Orleans. But I noticed they was a nigger trader round the place considerable lately. I begin to get one easy. Well, one night I creeps to the do pooty late, on the dough weren't quite shet, and I hear old missus tell de widder she gwine to sell me down to Orleans, but she didn't want to, but she could get $800 for me. And it oozed such a big stack of money she couldn't resist. DeWitter, she tried to get her to say she wouldn't do it, but I never waited to hear the rest. I lit out mighty quick, I tell you. I tuck out and shin down the hill, and spec to steal a skiff long to show summers above the town, but they was people a-stirring yet, so I hid in the old tumble-down cooper shop on the bank to wait for everybody to go away. Well, I was da all night. They was somebody round all the time. Long 'bout 6 in the morning skiffs begin to go by. In 'bout 8 or 9 every skiff that went long was talking about how your pap come over to the town and say you's killed. These last skiffs was full of ladies and gentlemen a-going over for to see the place. Sometimes they'd pull up at the show and take a res before they started across, so by the talk I got to know all about the killing. I's powerful sorry you's killed, Huck, but I ain't no mo now. I laid da under the shavings all day. I was hungry, but I weren't afeared. Because I knowed ole missus on de Witter woos going to start to the camp meeting right arter breakfast on be gone all day, and they knows I goes off with the cattle 'bout daylight, so they wouldn't spect to see me round the place, on so they wouldn't miss me till arter dark in the evening. The youther servants wouldn't miss me, case they'd shin out and take holiday soon as the old folks ooze out in the way. Well, when it come dark, I tuck out up the river road and went 'bout 2 mile or more to what they warn't no houses. I'd made up my mind 'bout what I's a-gwine to do. You see, EF, I kept on trying to get away afoot. The dogs UD tracked me. EF, I stole a skiff to cross over. They'd miss that skiff, you see, and they'd know 'bout wha I'd land on the other side, and wha to pick up my track. So I says, a raft is what I's arter. It doin' make no track. I see a light a-comin' round the pint by me, so I wade in and shove a log ahead of me and swum more'n halfway across the river and got in 'mongst the driftwood and kept my head down low and kinder swum again the current till the raft come along. Then I swum to the stern of it and tuck a hold. It clouded up in who's pooty dark for a little while, so I clum up and laid down on the planks. The men huz all way yonder in the middle, wha the lantern woos. The river woos a-risin', and they woos a good current. So I reckoned that by 4 in the morning, I'd be 25 mile down the river, and then I'd slip in just before daylight on Swim Asho, and take to the woods on the Illinois side. But I didn't have no luck. When we's most down to the head of the Islan, a man began to come aft with the lantern. I see it weren't no use for the weight, so I slid overboard and struck out for the Islan. Well, I had a notion I could land most anywheres, but I couldn't. Bank too bluff. I was most to the foot ere the Islam before I found a good place. I went into the woods and jedged I wouldn't fool with rafts no mo, long as they moved the lantern round so. I had my pipe and a plug or dog leg and some matches in my cap, on they weren't wet, so I was all right. And so you ain't had no meat nor bread to eat all this time. Why didn't you get mud turkles? How you gwine to get 'em? You can't slip up on grab, and how's a body gwine to hit, with a rock? How could a body do it in the night? And I weren't gwine to show myself on the bank in the daytime. Well, that's so. You've had to keep in the woods all the time, of course. Did you hear 'em shooting the cannon? Oh, yes. I know day was arter you. I see, go by ha. Watched, through the bushes. Some young birds come along, flying a yard or 2 at a time and lighting. Jim said it was a sign it was going to rain. He said it was a sign when young chickens flew that way, and so he reckoned it was the same way when young birds done it. I was going to catch some of them, but Jim wouldn't let me. He said it was death. He said his father laid mighty sick once, and some of them catched a bird, and his old granny said his father would die, and he did. And Jim said you mustn't count the things you're going to cook for dinner because that would bring bad luck. The same if you shook the tablecloth after sundown. And he said if a man owned a beehive and that man died, the bees must be told about it before sunup next morning, or else the bees would all weaken down and quit work and die. Jim said bees wouldn't sting idiots, but I didn't believe that because I had tried them lots of times myself, and they wouldn't sting me. I had heard about some of these things before, but not all of them. Jim knowed all kinds of signs. He said he knowed most everything. I said it looked to me like all the signs was about bad luck, and so I asked him if there weren't any good luck signs. He says, "Mighty few, and DE ain't no use to a body. What you want to know when good luck's a-comin' for? Want to keep it off?" And he said, "EF you's got hairy arms and a hairy breast. It's a sign dat you's a gwine to be rich. Well, dey's some use in a sign like dat, case it's so fur ahead. You see, maybe you's got to be po a long time fust, and so you might get discouraged and kill yourself you didn't know by the sign dat you gwine to be rich by maybe. Have you got hairy arms and a hairy breast, Jim? What's the use to ask dat question? Don't you see I has? Well, are you rich? No, but I been rich once, and gwine to be rich again. Once I had $14, but I tuck to speculatin' and got busted out. What did you speculate in, Jim? Well, fust I tackled stock. What kind of stock? Why, livestock cattle, you know. I put $10 in a cow, but I ain't gwine to resk no mo money in stock. The cow up and died on my hands. So you lost the $10. No, I didn't lose it all. I only lose about 9 of it. I sold the hide and taller for $1.10. You had $5.10 left. Did you speculate any more? Yes. You know that one-legged nigger dat belongs to old Misto Bradish? Well, he sot up a bank and say anybody dat put in $1 would get $4 mo at the end of the year. Well, all the niggers went in, but they didn't have much. I was the only one dat had much. So I stuck out for mo dan for dollars, and I said, I didn't get it, I'd start a bank myself. Well, of course, that nigger want to keep me out of the business because he says they weren't business enough for 2 banks. So he say I could put in my $5 on, he pay me $35 at the end of the year. So I done it. Then I reckoned I'd invest the $35 right off and keep things a-movin'. They was a nigger named Bob that had catched a wood flat and his master didn't know it, and I bought it off of him and told him to take the $35 when day end ere the year come. But somebody stole the wood flat that night, and next day the one-legged nigger say the bank's busted. So they didn't none us get no money. What did you do with the 10 cents, Jim? Well, I was gwine to spend it, but I had a dream. On the dream told me to give it to a nigger named Balaam. Balaam's ass, they call him for short. He's one of them chuckleheads, you know. But he's lucky, they say, and I see I weren't lucky. The dream say, let Balaam invest the 10 cents on he'd make a raise for me. Well, Balaam he tuck the money, and when he was in church he hear the preacher say that whoever give to the poor lend to the Lord, and bound to get his money back 100 times. So Balaam he tuck and give the 10 cents to the poor, and laid low to see what was gwine to come of it. Well, what did come of it, Jim? Nothing never come of it. I couldn't manage to collect that money no way, and Balaam he couldn't. I ain't gwine to lend no mo money doubt I see the security. Bound to get your money back 100 times, the preacher says. EF, I could get the 10 cents back. I'd call it squaw. I'll be gladder to chanced. Well, it's all right anyway, Jim, long as you're going to be rich again some time or other. Yes, and I's rich now, come to look at it. I owns myself, and I's worth $800. I wished I had the money. I wouldn't want no mo. Chapter 9. I wanted to go and look at a place right about the middle of the island that I'd found when I was exploring. So we started and soon got to it, because the island was only 3 miles long and 1/4 of a mile wide. This place was a tolerable long, steep hill or ridge about 40 foot high. We had a rough time getting to the top. The sides was so steep and the bushes so thick. We tramped and clumb around all over it, and by found a good big cavern in the rock, most up to the top on the side towards Illinois. The cavern was as big as 2 or 3 rooms bunched together, and Jim could stand up straight in it. It was cool in there. Jim was for putting our traps in there right away, but I said we didn't want to be climbing up and down there all the time. Jim said if we had the canoe hid in a good place and had all the traps in the cavern, we could rush there if anybody was to come to the island, and they would never find us without dogs. And besides, he said them little birds had said it was going to rain, and did I want the things to get wet? So we went back and got the canoe and paddled up abreast the cavern and lugged all the traps up there. Then we hunted up a place close by to hide the canoe in, amongst the thick willows. We took some fish off of the lines and set them again and begun to get ready for dinner. The door of the cavern was big enough to roll a hogshead in, and on one side of the door the floor stuck out a little bit and was flat and a good place to build a fire on. So we built it there and cooked dinner. We spread the blankets inside for a carpet and eat our dinner in there. We put all the other things handy at the back of the cavern. Pretty soon it darkened up and begun to thunder and lighten, so the birds was right about it. Directly it begun to rain, and it rained like all fury too, and I never see the wind blow so. It was one of these regular summer storms. It would get so dark that it looked all blue-black outside and lovely, and the rain would thrash along by so thick that the trees off a little ways looked dim and spiderwebby. And here would come a blast of wind that would bend the trees down and turn up the pale underside of the leaves. And then a perfect ripper of a gust would follow along and set the branches to tossing their arms as if they was just wild. And next, when it was just about the bluest and blackest, FST. It was as bright as glory, and you'd have a little glimpse of treetops a-plunging about away off yonder in the storm, hundreds of yards further than you could see before. Dark as sin again in a second, and now you'd hear the thunder let go with an awful crash and then go rumbling, grumbling, tumbling down the sky towards the underside of the world like rolling empty barrels downstairs, where it's long stairs and they bounce a good deal, you know. "Jim, this is nice," I says. "I wouldn't want to be nowhere else but here. Pass me along another hunk of fish and some hot cornbread." "Well, you wouldn't have been here if it hadn't have been for Jim. You'd have been down in the woods without any dinner and getting mos drownded too. Dat you would, honey. Chickens knows when it's gwine to rain, and so do the birds, Chile." The river went on raising and raising for 10 or 12 days, till at last it was over the banks. The water was 3 or 4 foot deep on the island in the low places and on the Illinois bottom. On that side it was a good many miles wide, but on the Missouri side it was the same old distance across a half a mile, because the Missouri shore was just a wall of high bluffs. Daytimes we paddled all over the island in the canoe. It was mighty cool and shady in the deep woods, even if the sun was blazing outside. We went winding in and out amongst the trees, and sometimes the vines hung so thick we had to back away and go some other way. Well, on every old broken-down tree you could see rabbits and snakes and such things. And when the island had been overflowed a day or two, they got so tame, on account of being hungry, that you could paddle right up and put your hand on them if you wanted to. But not the snakes and turtles. They would slide off in the water. The ridge our cavern was in was full of them. We could have had pets enough if we'd wanted them. One night we catched a little section of a lumber raft, nice pine planks. It was 12 foot wide and about 15 or 16 foot long, and the top stood above water 6 or 7 inches, a solid level floor. We could see saw logs go by in the daylight sometimes, but we let them go. We didn't show ourselves in daylight. Another night when we was up at the head of the island just before daylight, here comes a frame house down on the west side. She was a 2-story and tilted over considerable. We paddled out and got aboard, clumb in at an upstairs window, but it was too dark to see yet, so we made the canoe fast and set in her to wait for daylight. The light begun to come before we got to the foot of the island. Then we looked in at the window. We could make out a bed and a table and 2 old chairs and lots of things around about on the floor, and there was clothes hanging against the wall. There was something laying on the floor in the far corner that looked like a man. So Jim says, "Hello, you." but it didn't budge. So I hollered again, and then Jim says, "The man ain't asleep. He's dead. You hold still. I'll go and see." He went and bent down and looked and says, "It's a dead man. Yes, indeedy. Naked too. He's been shot in the back. I reckon he's been dead 2 or 3 days. Come in, Huck, but don't look at his face. It's too gashly." I didn't look at him at all. Jim throwed some old rags over him, but he needn't done it. I didn't want to see him. There was heaps of old greasy cards scattered around over the floor, and old whiskey bottles and a couple of masks made out of black cloth. And all over the walls was the ignorantest kind of words and pictures made with charcoal. There was 2 old dirty calico dresses and a sunbonnet, and some women's underclothes hanging against the wall, and some men's clothing too. We put the lot into the canoe. It might come good. There was a boy's old speckled straw hat on the floor. I took that too. And there was a bottle that had had milk in it, and it had a rag stopper for a baby to suck. We would have took the bottle, but it was broke. There was a seedy old chest and an old hair trunk with the hinges broke. They stood open, but there weren't nothing left in them that was any account. The way things was scattered about, we reckoned the people left in a hurry and weren't fixed so as to carry off most of their stuff. We got an old tin lantern and a butcher knife without any handle, and a brand new Barlow knife worth 2 bits in any store, and a lot of tallow candles, and a tin candlestick, and a gourd, and a tin cup, and a ratty old bed quilt off the bed, and a reticule with needles and pins and beeswax and buttons and thread and all such truck in it, and a hatchet and some nails, and a fish line as thick as my little finger with some monstrous hooks on it, and a roll of buckskin, and a leather dog collar, and a horseshoe, and some vials of medicine that didn't have no label on them. And just as we was leaving, I found a tolerable good curry comb, and Jim, he found a ratty old fiddle bow and a wooden leg. The straps was broke off of it, but, barring that, it was a good enough leg, though it was too long for me and not long enough for Jim, and we couldn't find the other one, though we hunted all around. And so, take it all around, we made a good haul. When we was ready to shove off, we was a 1/4 of a mile below the island, and it was pretty broad day. So I made Jim lay down in the canoe and cover up with the quilt, because if he set up, people could tell he was a nigger a good ways off. I paddled over to the Illinois shore and drifted down most a 1/2 a mile doing it. I crept up the dead water under the bank and hadn't no accidents and didn't see nobody. We got home all safe. Chapter 10. After breakfast, I wanted to talk about the dead man and guess out how he come to be killed, but Jim didn't want to. He said it would fetch bad luck. And besides, he said, he might come and hand us. He said a man that warn't buried was more likely to go a-handing around than one that was planted and comfortable. That sounded pretty reasonable, so I didn't say no more, but I couldn't keep from studying over it and wishing I knowed who shot the man and what they done it for. We rummaged the clothes we'd got and found $8 in silver sewed up in the lining of an old blanket overcoat. Jim said he reckoned the people in that house stole the coat, because if they'd a knowed the money was there, they wouldn't have left it. I said I reckoned they killed him too, but Jim didn't want to talk about that. I says, "Now you think it's bad luck, but what did you say when I fetched in the snakeskin that I found on the top of the ridge day before yesterday? You said it was the worst bad luck in the world to touch a snakeskin with my hands. Well, here's your bad luck. We've raked in all this truck and $8 besides. I wish we could have some bad luck like this every day, Jim." "Never you mind, honey, never you mind. Don't you get too part. It's a-comin'. Mind I tell you, it's a-comin'." It did come, too. It was a Tuesday that we had that talk. Well, after dinner Friday, we was laying around in the grass at the upper end of the ridge and got out of tobacco. I went to the cavern to get some and found a rattlesnake in there. I killed him and curled him up on the foot of Jim's blanket, ever so natural, thinking there'd be some fun when Jim found him there. Well, by night I forgot all about the snake, and when Jim flung himself down on the blanket while I struck a light, the snake's mate was there and bit him. He jumped up yelling, and the first thing the light showed was the varmint curled up and ready for another spring. I laid him out in a second with a stick, and Jim grabbed Pap's whiskey jug and begun to pour it down. He was barefooted, and the snake bit him right on the heel. That all comes of my being such a fool as to not remember that wherever you leave a dead snake, its mate always comes there and curls around it. Jim told me to chop off the snake's head and throw it away, and then skin the body and roast a piece of it. I done it, and he eat it and said it would help cure him. He made me take off the rattles and tie them around his wrist too. He said that would help. Then I slid out quiet and throwed the snakes clear away amongst the bushes, for I weren't going to let Jim find out it was all my fault, not if I could help it. Jim sucked and sucked at the jug, and now and then he got out of his head and pitched around and yelled. But every time he come to himself, he went to sucking at the jug again. His foot swelled up pretty big, and so did his leg. But by and by the drunk begun to come, and so I judged he was all right. But I'd druther been bit with a snake than Pap's whiskey. Jim was laid up for 4 days and nights. Then the swelling was all gone and he was around again. I made up my mind I wouldn't ever take a holt of a snakeskin again with my hands, now that I see what had come of it. Jim said he reckoned I would believe him next time. And he said that handling a snakeskin was such awful bad luck that maybe we hadn't got to the end of it yet. He said he'd druther see the new moon over his left shoulder as much as 1,000 times than take up a snakeskin in his hand. Well, I was getting to feel that way myself, though I've always reckoned that looking at the new moon over your left shoulder is one of the carelessest and foolishest things a body can do. Old Hank Bunker done it once and bragged about it, and in less than 2 years he got drunk and fell off of the shot tower and spread himself out so that he was just a kind of a layer, as you may say. And they slid him edgeways between 2 barn doors for a coffin and buried him so they say, but I didn't see it. Pap told me. But anyway, it all come of looking at the moon that way, like a fool. Well, the days went along, and the river went down between its banks again. And about the first thing we'd done was to bait one of the big hooks with a skinned rabbit and set it and catch a catfish that was as big as a man, being 6 foot 2 inches long and weighed over 200 pounds. We couldn't handle him, of course. He would have flung us into Illinois. We just sat there and watched him rip and tear around till he drowned. We found a brass button in his stomach and a round ball and lots of rubbish. We split the ball open with the hatchet and there was a spool in it. Jim said he'd had it there a long time to coat it over so and make a ball of it. It was as big a fish as was ever catched in the Mississippi, I reckon. Jim said he hadn't ever seen a bigger one. He would have been worth a good deal over at the village. They peddle out such a fish as that by the pound in the market house there. Everybody buys some of him. His meat's as white as snow and makes a good fry. Next morning I said it was getting slow and dull and I wanted to get a stirring up some way. I said I reckoned I would slip over the river and find out what was going on. Jim liked that notion, but he said I must go in the dark and look sharp. Then he studied it over and said, couldn't I put on some of them old things and dress up like a girl? That was a good notion too. So we shortened up one of the calico gowns and I turned up my trouser legs to my knees and got into it. Jim hitched it behind with the hooks, and it was a fair fit. I put on the sunbonnet and tied it under my chin, and then for a body to look in and see my face was like looking down a joint of stovepipe. Jim said nobody would know me, even in the daytime hardly. I practiced around all day to get the hang of the things, and by I could do pretty well in them, only Jim said I didn't walk like a girl. And he said I must quit pulling up my gown to get at my breeches pocket. I took notice and done better. I started up the Illinois shore in the canoe just after dark. I started across to the town from a little below the ferry landing, and the drift of the current fetched me in at the bottom of the town. I tied up and started along the bank. There was a light burning in a little shanty that hadn't been lived in for a long time, and I wondered who had took up quarters there. I slipped up and peeped in at the window. There was a woman about 40-year-old in there knitting by a candle that was on a pine table. I didn't know her face. She was a stranger, for you couldn't start a face in that town that I didn't know. Now this was lucky, because I was weakening. I was getting afraid I had come. People might know my voice and find me out. But if this woman had been in such a little town 2 days, she could tell me all I wanted to know. So I knocked at the door and made up my mind I wouldn't forget I was a girl. Chapter 11. "Come in," says the woman, and I did. She says, "Take a cheer." I done it. She looked me all over with her little shiny eyes and says, "What might your name be?" "Sarah Williams." "Whereabouts do you live?" "In this neighborhood." "No, in Hookerville, 7 miles below. I've walked all the way and I'm all tired out." "Hungry too, I reckon. I'll find you something." "No, I ain't hungry. I was so hungry I had to stop 2 miles below here at a farm, so I ain't hungry no more. It's what makes me so late. My mother's down sick and out of money and everything, and I come to tell my Uncle Abner Moore. He lives at the upper end of the town," she says. "I ain't ever been here before. Do you know him?" "No, but I don't know everybody yet. I haven't lived here quite 2 weeks. It's a considerable ways to the upper end of the town. You better stay here all night. Take off your bonnet." "No," I says. "I'll rest a while, I reckon, and go on. I ain't afeard of the dark." She said she wouldn't let me go by myself, but her husband would be in by and by, maybe in an hour and a half, and she'd send him along with me. Then she got to talking about her husband, and about her relations up the river, and her relations down the river, and about how much better off they used to was, and how they didn't know, but they'd made a mistake coming to our town instead of letting well alone, and so on, till I was afeard I had made a mistake coming to her to find out what was going on in the town. But by and by she dropped on to Pap and the murder, and then I was pretty willing to let her clatter right along. She told about me and Tom Sawyer finding the $6,000, only she got it 10, and all about Pap and what a hard lot he was, and what a hard lot I was, and at last she got down to where I was murdered. I says, "Who done it? We've heard considerable about these goings-on down in Hookerville, but we don't know who was that killed Huck Finn." "Well, I reckon there's a right smart chance of people here that'd like to know who killed him. Some think old Finn done it himself." "No, is that so?" "Most everybody thought it at first. He'll never know how nigh he come to getting lynched. But before night they changed around and judged it was done by a runaway nigger named Jim. Why I stopped. I reckoned I better keep still. She run on and never noticed I had put in at all. "The nigger run off the very night Huck Finn was killed. So there's a reward out for him, $300. And there's a reward out for old Finn too, $200. You see, he come to town the morning after the murder and told about it, and was out with him on the ferry boat hunt, and right away after he up and left. Before night they wanted to lynch him, but he was gone, you see. Well, next day they found out the nigger was gone. They found out he hadn't been seen since 10 o'clock the night the murder was done. So then they put it on him, you see. And while they was full of it, next day, back comes old Finn, and went boo-hooing to Judge Thatcher to get money to hunt for the nigger all over Illinois with. The judge gave him some, and that evening he got drunk and was around till after midnight with a couple of mighty hard-looking strangers, and then went off with them. Well, he hain't come back since, and they ain't looking for him back till this thing blows over a little. For people thinks now that he killed his boy and fixed things so folks would think robbers done it, and then he'd get Huck's money without having to bother a long time with a lawsuit. People do say he weren't any too good to do it. Oh, he's sly, I reckon. If he don't come back for a year, he'll be all right. You can't prove anything on him, you know. Everything will be quieted down then, and he'll walk in Huck's money as easy as nothing. Yes, I reckon so. I don't see nothing in the way of it. Has everybody get thinking the nigger done it? Oh no, not everybody. A good many thinks he done it, but they'll get the nigger pretty soon now, and maybe they can scare it out of him. Why? Are they after him yet? Well, You're innocent, ain't you? Does $300 lay around every day for people to pick up? Some folks think the nigger ain't far from here. I'm one of them, but I ain't talked it around. A few days ago, I was talking with an old couple that lives next door in the log shanty, and they happened to say hardly anybody ever goes to that island over yonder that they call Jackson's Island. Don't anybody live there, says I. No, nobody, says they. I didn't say any more, but I'd done some thinking. I was pretty near certain I'd seen smoke over there, about the head of the island, a day or two before that, so I says to myself, like as not that nigger's hiding over there. Anyway, says I, it's worth the trouble to give the place a hunt. I ain't seen any smoke since, so I reckon maybe he's gone, if it was him, but husband's going over to see him and another man. He was gone up the river, but he got back today, and I told him as soon as he got here 2 hours ago. I had got so uneasy I couldn't set still. I had to do something with my hands, so I took up a needle off of the table and went to threading it. My hands shook, and I was making a bad job of it. When the woman stopped talking, I looked up, and she was looking at me pretty curious and smiling a little. I put down the needle and thread and let on to be interested, and I was too, and says, $300 is a power of money. I wish my mother could get it. Is your husband going over there tonight? Oh, yes. He went uptown with the man I was telling you of to get a boat and see if they could borrow another gun. They'll go over after midnight. Couldn't they see better if they was to wait till daytime? Yes. And couldn't the nigger see better too? After midnight he'll likely be asleep, and they can slip around through the woods and hunt up his campfire all the better for the dark if he's got one. I didn't think of that. The woman kept looking at me pretty curious, and I didn't feel a bit comfortable. Pretty soon she says, "What did you say your name was, honey?" Mary Williams. Somehow it didn't seem to me that I said it was Mary before, so I didn't look up. Seemed to me I said it was Sarah, so I felt sort of cornered and was afeared maybe I was looking it too. I wished the woman would say something more. The longer she sat still, the uneasier I was. But now she says, "Honey, I thought you said it was Sarah when you first come in." Oh, yes'm, I did. Sarah Mary Williams. Sarah's my first name. Some calls me Sarah, some calls me Mary. Oh, that's the way of it? Yes'm. I was feeling better then, but I wished I was out of there anyway. I couldn't look up yet. Well, the woman fell to talking about how hard times was, and how poor they had to live, and how the rats was as free as if they owned the place, and so forth and so on, and then I got easy again. She was right about the rats. You'd see one stick his nose out of a hole in the corner every little while. She said she had to have things handy to throw at them when she was alone, or they wouldn't give her no peace. She showed me a bar of lead twisted up into a knot, and said she was a good shot with it generally, but she'd wrenched her arm a day or two ago, and didn't know whether she could throw true now. But she watched for a chance, and directly banged away at a rat. But she missed him wide and said, "Ouch!" It hurt her arm so. Then she told me to try for the next one. I wanted to be getting away before the old man got back, but of course I didn't let on. I got the thing, and the first rat that showed his nose I let drive, and if he'd a stayed where he was, he'd a been a tolerable sick rat. She said that was first rate, and she reckoned I would hive the next one. She went and got the lump of lead and fetched it back, and brought along a hank of yarn which she wanted me to help her with. I held up my 2 hands, and she put the hank over them and went on talking about her and her husband's matters. But she broke off to say, "Keep your eye on the rats. You better have the lead in your lap handy." So she dropped the lump into my lap just at that moment, and I clapped my legs together on it, and she went on talking. But only about a minute. Then she took off the hank and looked me straight in the face, and very pleasant, and says, "Come now, what's your real name?" What, Mom? What's your real name? Is it Bill or Tom or Bob, or what is it? I reckon I shook like a leaf, and I didn't know hardly what to do. But I says, Please to don't poke fun at a poor girl like me, Mom. If I'm in the way here, I'll— No, you won't. Sit down and stay where you are. I ain't going to hurt you, and I ain't going to tell on you nother. You just tell me your secret and trust me. I'll keep it. And what's more, I'll help you. So'll my old man if you want him to. You see, you're a runaway prentice, that's all. It ain't anything. There ain't no harm in it. You've been treated bad, and you made up your mind to cut. Bless you, child. I wouldn't tell on you. Tell me all about it now. That's a good boy. So I said it wouldn't be no use to try to play it any longer, and I would just make a clean breast and tell her everything, but she mustn't go back on her promise. Then I told her my father and mother was dead, and the law had bound me out to a mean old farmer in the country 30 miles back from the river, and he treated me so bad I couldn't stand it no longer. He went away to be gone a couple of days, and so I took my chance and stole some of his daughter's old clothes and cleared out, and I had been 3 nights coming the 30 miles. I traveled nights and hid daytimes and slept, and the bag of bread and meat I carried from home lasted me all the way, and I had a plenty. I said I believed my Uncle Abner Moore would take care of me, and so that was why I struck out for this town of Goshen. Goshen, child. This ain't Goshen. This is St. Petersburg. Goshen's 10 miles further up the river. Who told you this was Goshen? Why, a man I met at daybreak this morning, just as I was going to turn into the woods for my regular sleep. He told me when the roads forked I must take the right hand and 5 miles would fetch me to Goshen. He was drunk, I reckon. He told you just exactly wrong. Well, he did act like he was drunk, but it ain't no matter now. I gotta be moving along. I'll fetch Goshen before daylight. Hold on a minute. I'll put you up a snack to eat. You might want it. So she put me up a snack and says, Say, when a cow's laying down, which end of her gets up first? Answer up prompt now. Don't stop to study over it. Which end gets up first? The hind end, Mum. Well then, a horse? The forward end, Mum. Which side of a tree does the moss grow on? North side. If 15 cows is browsing on a hillside, how many of them eats with their heads pointed the same direction? The whole 15, Mum. Well, I reckon you have lived in the country. I thought maybe you was trying to hocus me again. What's your real name now? George Peters, Mum. Well, try to remember it, George. Don't forget and tell me it's Alexander before you go, and then get out by saying it's George Alexander when I catch you. And don't go about women in that old calico. You do a girl tolerable poor, but you might fool men maybe. Bless you, child. When you set out to thread a needle, don't hold the thread still and fetch the needle up to it. Hold the needle still and poke the thread at it. That's the way a woman most always does, but a man always does t'other way. And when you throw at a rat or anything, hit yourself up a tiptoe and fetch your hand up over your head as awkward as you can, and miss your rat about 6 or 7 foot. Throw stiff-armed from the shoulder like there was a pivot there for it to turn on, like a girl, not from the wrist and elbow, with your arm out to one side, like a boy. And mind you, when a girl tries to catch anything in her lap, she throws her knees apart. She don't clap them together, the way you did when you catch the lump of lead. Why, I spotted you for a boy when you was threading the needle, and I contrived the other things just to make certain. Now, trot along to your uncle, Sarah Mary Williams George Alexander Peters, and if you get into trouble, you send word to Mrs. Judith Loftus, which is me, and I'll do what I can to get you out of it. Keep the river road all the way, and next time you tramp, take shoes and socks with you. The river road's a rocky one, and your feet'll be in a condition when you get to Goshen, I reckon. I went up the bank about 50 yards, and then I doubled on my tracks and slipped back to where my canoe was, a good piece below the house. I jumped in and was off in a hurry. I went upstream far enough to make the head of the island and then started across. I took off the sunbonnet, for I didn't want no blinders on then. When I was about the middle, I heard the clock begin to strike, so I stops and listens. The sound come faint over the water, but clear. 11. When I struck the head of the island, I never waited to blow, though I was most winded, but I shoved right into the timber where my old camp used to be, and started a good fire there on a high and dry spot. Then I jumped in the canoe and dug out for our place, 1.5 miles below as hard as I could go. I landed and slopped through the timber and up the ridge and into the cavern. There Jim laid, sound asleep on the ground. I roused him out and says, "Get up and hump yourself, Jim. There ain't a minute to lose. They're after us." Jim never asked no questions. He never said a word, but the way he worked for the next half an hour showed about how he was scared. By that time, everything we had in the world was on our raft, and she was ready to be shoved out from the willow cove where she was hid. We put out the campfire at the cavern the first thing, and didn't show a candle outside after that. I took the canoe out from the shore a little piece, and took a look. But if there was a boat around, I couldn't see it, for stars and shadows ain't good to see by. Then we got out the raft and slipped along down in the shade, past the foot of the island dead still, never saying a word.